I'm glad to be here today, and I kind of have two talks here. So one is, and they're somewhat unrelated. So I've really broken them into two separate talks. The first one, like Patricia said, is going to be really about mapping out kind of species ecological affinity to different topographical sites. So we'll get into that, and that'll take about maybe a half an hour or so. And then I want to shift gears and talk a little bit more about a lot of the recent work that the Department of Natural Resources has gotten involved with both UNB and CFS in terms of trying to figure out exactly kind of how our forests are going to grow under climate change. So just to start, so on the Forest Research website, you can go on this website now. It's FORUS Research, Forest Research, and this is a talk that I gave at the Canadian Woodlands Forum in the fall. I'll be repeating that talk today, but you can go on this site and you can download these what I call species ecological affinity maps, and we have them for kind of the key commercial species in our forests. So sugar maple, yellow birch, American beech, poplar, red maple, white birch, red spruce, white spruce, the pines, hemlock, eastern white cedar, and tamarack. The presentation that I'm going to give today is available here. And I also have a number of just slides on some of the accuracy statistics of some of these maps. So these maps are available in raster format. They're GeoTIFF files, so you can intersect them and use them in a geodatabase. With that, I'll get into kind of how those maps were developed. I guess the key thing about these maps is that we're not trying to predict where species are now. So you wouldn't go to this map to say, okay, where is sugar maple in the province now? What you might find useful about these maps is to find out where sugar maple would be likely to grow, at least in the current climate, based on historical information. And I'll just spend the next 15 minutes or so kind of telling you how I rolled these predictions up into these maps. So this is an algorithm that I developed maybe 5 years ago or so when I was doing a lot of site productivity work. And I kind of got a kick in the butt from Gaetan last year to maybe actually use this algorithm to predict species affinity to different topographical sites. So a lot of this comes from getting that kick in the butt from Gaetan, and so we have him to thank for this. And it's not the first time this has been done. So Vince Zelazny, under the ecological land classification work that was done by the province, took a crack at this and mapped out species affinity based on our timber cruises, essentially, what our timber cruises were telling us by map sheet in terms of percent composition of different species. And you can clearly see northern and southern affinities of different softwood and hardwood species here. But this is really mapped at a very coarse scale, so at the map sheet scale. So the purpose here was to really kind of delve into, can we map out these species to different topographical positions as a function of depth of water table, slope, elevation, and so on. And the challenging part of this work is that, our forests are very intensively managed now, and it's difficult to tell sometimes where sugar maple, once grew. We have a lot of plantations out there in certain parts of the landscape, and it is kind of difficult to tell, really what used to be there. So this is an area up near Madawaska, and very intensively managed. And the idea is to be able to predict what would have been here if this management over the past 100 years or so hadn't have occurred. So where would sugar maple ecologically occur? The key objective here is to predict the ecological relative abundance or affinity, probability of occurrence. It's another way to look at this, as a function of local topography from provincial ground surveys and photo interpretation. So we're pretty lucky in New Brunswick to have a wealth of ground plot information, about 30,000 timber surveys over since the 1980s. And we also have probably the longest running photo interp cycle in Canada, if not North America, dating back to the 1980s. So we'll bring that information to bear here. And the reason why I think that this is useful for climate change purposes, but also for a lot of other reasons, is one, planning silviculture activities. So if we know a site has a strong sugar maple or red maple affinity, it might not be such a good idea to put a plantation on it. Maybe you're going to have a hard time controlling that competition. We're using it right now as to improve our forest succession predictions following disturbance. So if we do a clear cut, what do we expect to have come back after that clear cut? I think it's going to be useful in terms of building better site productivity maps. Generally, if we find sugar maple somewhere, it's usually a pretty good site. And if we find black spruce, it's a poor site. So in my work, this is knowing what species are on what sites is a very, very good indicator of site productivity. The other key one that we're trying to use it for now is trying to identify, okay, where do species exist in the province today, and where are they likely to migrate to, and what is the rate of change of that migration under climate change. So we haven't quite tackled that one yet, but that could be a potential use of these maps. So if we rewind 40 years, and we can do that with our photos and our photo interpretation back to 1984, we can get actually a pretty decent snapshot of what the forest did look like before a lot of that intensive management. And where possible, we've done that. And we've taken those stand polygons out and treated them essentially as samples of what that forest used to look like. We also have ground plots in those conditions, and unfortunately in the 1980s, the species composition mapping was relatively coarse. So we were mapping out spruce groups and tolerant hardwood and intolerant hardwood, but not necessarily red maple or sugar maple. So the ground plots help us fill in those gaps a bit and get back to a statistically less biased estimate of species actually on the ground. It's kind of late in the afternoon, and I don't really want to get into the calculations too much here, but they are available in the presentation. I'll go through them very briefly. It's actually a pretty neat algorithm. So there's about 1 million of these photo-interpreted stands, right? So we're already talking about a lot of data here. And we want to blend across inventories. There's stands out there today that still haven't really had a lot of harvesting in the past 100 years. We want to use those, they have better information. We want to marry that with stands that have been harvested and look backwards in time back to the 1980s to get what it used to be. For the rest, areas that have been disturbed in the 1980s, 1970s, that are plantation, we really don't know what was there. Now, we used a nearest neighbor algorithm to fill in the gaps, fill in the unknowns. And what we did is we tried to relate what we were seeing in terms of species composition to local topography. And the key important aspect of this method is that it's not a general model applied to all of New Brunswick. It's a model that's adaptive, and it moves across the landscape, almost like a 2-kilometer moving window, and looking across topography to identify the proportion on different topographical positions that had, say, 50% sugar maple, 50% yellow birch, or 100% black spruce. And that's a very, very important feature of this algorithm, because if you look at depth to water table in the lowlands of New Brunswick versus the uplands of New Brunswick, you get completely different relationships to species. So in the lowlands of New Brunswick, you'll get, when depth to water table is very high, typically you're looking at black spruce, sometimes cedar. But in the uplands, it means something completely different, because often the depth to water table is on a nice gentle slope, and it's actually a decent stream running down a slope. And in that case, it's beautiful, tolerant hardwood. So if you build a model that's just generic across the entire province, it's not going to work. You need something that can adapt across the landscape and can associate species to those topographical positions. The other thing I found in looking and doing some of the site productivity work I've been involved with is that sometimes you just see weird occurrences on the landscape. Black spruce bogs that depth to water table and soils can't necessarily explain, but yet there it is, right? And having an algorithm be able to pick up on that and associate that with that local area is very useful. So we start out with 1 million stands in that algorithm. And for every one of those stands, we build a localized linear regression model to predict the composition as a function of topography. And then we take those models, and I do kind of a neighborhood grab for a given location, and say I pick 20 of those models, and I average the predictions of 20 of those models onto every single 20 by 20 meter cell across the province. It works out to about 175 million predictions. So it's fairly intensive. It's, like I said, it's kind of a neat algorithm. And what results are these maps? If we just stick to photo interpretation, like I said, it's a little too coarse. We run into issues with the 1980s tolerant hardwood versus intolerant hardwood coarseness of species interpretation. So we went back and tried to integrate in these 30,000 timber cruises and refit the models based on ground composition rather than photo interpreted composition. And we basically went through the same process with these ground plots. In terms of some of the accuracy statistics, it was generally unbiased in predicting species composition across the region. One of the interesting things was that species that had strong ecological site affinity, like sugar maple or black spruce, were typically predicted to have the highest accuracy, and that kind of makes sense, right? Black spruce is generally associated with your wetter areas, sugar maple with more distinct upland sites, and that was generally true across the board. So in using these maps, I think you got to kind of keep that in mind, that if you're to use them, you're probably best off to use maybe sugar maple and black spruce, yellow birch, some of these species that have this strong site affinity. Species like red maple that just tends to occur everywhere was mapped relatively inaccurately. And I don't know if we should really consider it inaccurate. I think it's just suggesting that red maple occurs quite often everywhere, and that's just what the map says. Same with white pine. I mean, you look at the white pine distribution across the province, and it kind of gets a north-south differential correct, but in the south, it's generally mapped at a very low percentage across the entire southern range, because it kind of occurs in kind of incidental places in most stands across that whole southern range. So just kind of keep that in mind when using these maps. Again, like I said at the beginning, this is more about predicting the ecologically likelihood of encountering these species on different topographical positions. If you want to know what's actually there at any given stand, you go to the provincial photo interpretation inventory. So just looking at these same sites here again, if we were to map out, if we go back to that image there, this is the same image except mapped out with these species affinity maps. This is for shade tolerant quality hardwoods, so let's say sugar maple and yellow birch. And I've overlaid the depth of water table on this. So if we look back at this map, you can see some of the areas were harvested back in the 1980s here. And those are all filled in with what we would predict to be there in terms of species. This is the same area mapped out for a few other different combinations, upland conifer in the lower left, sugar maple, and intolerant mid-tolerant hardwood. So if you're looking at managing sugar maple, obviously some of these spots here would be good choices. If we kind of head east a bit, over into the highlands, look at kind of the Mount Carlton area, Popple Depot area. You can see the Nipisiguit River running through there. We have a much higher presence of balsam fir. There's definitely some jack pine in there. And again, yellow birch and sugar maple over here. Getting into some better soils, better bedrock over on this side. And quite a bit of black spruce. So I think this is a big step, a big improvement in terms of mapping local ecological affinity. We kind of let the species speak for themselves. We have incomplete soils information and incomplete depth of water table. There's errors in a lot of that mapping. It's improving over time, but there's enough error that it makes it difficult to predict species to ecological sites. So in this sense, we're letting the species speak for themselves. In future work, we're hoping to incorporate some of Shane Furtz's new soil attribute maps. We've yet to incorporate LiDAR elevation, slope, and aspect. Charles Borks's soil water availability and drought maps could also be introduced as variables. We could try some alternate filtering strategies to remove more area with clear-cut history. And we could look at refining the algorithm. One of the other things I forgot to mention about these maps is that if you add them all up, they're not going to add up to 100%. There's no normalization of these maps, so it's just simply predicting the proportion of sugar maple or yellow birch, and due to error in any of those models, it's not going to always add up to 100%, but if you want to, you can normalize that. The other thing is that we didn't predict all species, so you're always going to have some other hardwoods and other softwoods in there that aren't predicted. Just like to thank Gaetan for seeing this through, and Heidi Ertl for doing a lot of kind of technical support and review of this work. The funding for this was provided by the NRCan Climate Adaptation Platform through the Faculty of Forestry and Environmental Management and the Northern Hardwood Research Institute. And there was a lot of in-kind data provided and support through the Department of Natural Resources. So that's it for that one. Okay. Yep. Any questions?
Actually, yesterday somebody was asking me, what is the unit? I could not explain it.
Yeah.
If you look at the raster, can you in 2 minutes explain what the unit means?
Okay, so imagine walking along a tolerant hardwood ridge. You're walking through a yellow birch stand, a sugar maple stand. You might come to a stand that has more beech in it, and then you might encounter maybe a pocket of fir, right? So the algorithm tries to predict the proportion of sugar maple that would occur along that walk. Okay, it's not trying to predict where the sugar maple is on that slope, right? But given that we're walking along the slope, and generally the ecological conditions are the same slope, same aspect, same elevation, same soils, what would we predict in terms of how often we were going to encounter sugar maple, right? that helps. So if we have 50%, then you would expect that you would encounter sugar maple presence 50% of the time. You might encounter a few yellow birch and other species, but on average, you're going to encounter sugar maple 50% of the time. Yeah. Okay. So, thanks, Patricia. So when Patricia asked me to talk here, she asked me to talk about the species affinity mapping. And I said, well, isn't this a climate change workshop? Like, do you want me to talk a little bit about what we're doing with climate change research? I mean, the species affinity mapping was part of that. But we also have a lot of research on the go here within the department and with partners that I think would be useful to talk about today. So I'm going to go through a little bit of that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Anthony has done, and I don't know if Anthony's still here. He was here for a second. But some of his work and how we're trying to move that work forward together. I think some of these core questions came up this morning with Charles's talk. Particularly, Bill mentioned, like, okay, if fir is going to decline, why is it going to decline? Is it that it's just going to grow slower and things are going to outcompete it, or is it just magically going to die at some year, or is it just that it's not going to be able to reproduce anymore? And so when we look at some of Anthony's work and Charles's work on this species shift modeling, and also NRCan's models with respect to fir shift, suitability mapping. They're quite extreme, and we're trying to get a handle on, well, what are really the mechanisms around why this is happening? And we need to understand those in order to build silviculture prescriptions and adaptation strategies to deal with this. After Anthony kind of published his work on I think he's got kind of a paper out on predicting changes in the Acadian forest over the 21st century, and they're fairly dramatic. And we kind of called them into the office there and said, hey, we want to partner with you. We want to better understand this. We want to integrate this into our models, our strategic planning models. But we need to better understand why these changes are occurring in your models. And we want to kind of work with you to be able to make it so that we can run your scenarios in our models. Our focus immediately went to, well, how is tree growth rate exactly going to change? Given changes in CO2 concentration, growing degree days, increased growing season temperature, plant water availability changes, and also tree establishment and survival. Should I kill trees earlier in my models? Should I grow them faster? How exactly should I play this out in our strategic timber supply models? Another question, a key question here, is understanding genetics of our current trees and trees coming up maybe from the south. So how much genetic variability is there out there today, and how much can genetic selection help us adapt? What can we do with assisted migration and silviculture treatments? So I'm not going to focus on that one as much today. I'll talk about one project we're trying to get off the rails here, or on the rails, but I'm mainly focusing on the first two here today. So in terms of ongoing research, I'm just going to list some of the projects that we're either using or involved with directly. One of the real neat ones that's available through NRCan. NRCan has a lot of maps actually available, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen them and are aware of them. particularly the shift maps that are showing balsam fir shifting far up north under different climate change scenarios. These are all available on their website. Anthony's used that research in a lot of his work directly. And this is really where Anthony comes in his paper. He used a model called PICUS and Landis. It's a biological simulation model. And he used a lot of the predictions from NRCan with respect to these, I guess, looking at the range of where balsam fir is today and the climate that matches up with that range, and saying, okay, if we shift that climate up north, then we expect balsam fir to also shift up north. And he's translated that into a quantifiable effect on growth and survival in his model, and that's essentially how his model has made predictions for our region. I'm going to get into more of that during this talk, but understanding that and improving those models is a key part of this research. The other thing we asked Anthony to help us out with, and he's really leading this, is we said, well, is there more empirical evidence we could bring to bear in terms of some of these projections you're making? So we came up with the idea, well, there's a lot of permanent sample plots from across North America that have balsam fir in them. The U.S. Forest Service has permanent sample plots that are all available online throughout every state. We could quickly grab that information and look at growth rates and survival rates of different species across their entire range, and maybe get some more empirical evidence around about, under different growing degree days, what we would expect in terms of growth rates and survival rates. I know Anthony is involved with conducting some greenhouse growth chamber experiments with seedlings, trying to push temperature up to what we would expect in 100 years and seeing what happens to spruce and fir. And Loic Dorangeville down at UNB is doing the same thing. So we're keeping an eye on those. Charles is doing a lot of plant water availability mapping. He didn't mention it during the talk, maybe because it's not completely developed yet, but under the UNB project, what we're hoping to get out of that project is daily drought mapping on a very 30-meter resolution topographical basis for all of New Brunswick. So very high resolution, almost daily predictions of drought over 100 years. And he's having a hard time doing that through just the sheer computations involved with that. But the idea is to try to get a better handle on the relative frequency of drought we might expect across different topographical positions and locations in the province. There's been some work down at UNB, and I think one of the grad students or undergrad students presented a thesis recently on looking at red spruce seed source trial data sets and moving red spruce from northern regions down to southern regions, and found that the northern red spruce actually did better in the south. There's a number of those types of studies going on. The one issue with those studies is that typically those studies were set up without climate change in mind. It was generally these seed source trial data sets were built around tree improvement and moving seed zones, maybe a couple of seed zones down, but not to the extent we're going to see in terms of movement under climate change. So what we'd like to do is kind of take that a step further, and through Loic Dorangeville down at UNB, and partnerships with UNB and CFS and DNR and also JD Irving, what we'd like to do is set up a fairly large project of moving a lot of our seed down into the northeast, as far down as Connecticut. And Loic's organized a number of different research outfits, universities down the northeastern seaboard, and we've got agreements in place with them, and hopefully under Sylvie 21, a new federal research funding arrangement, we'll be able to get that project funded. And we'll be moving hardwood stock and softwood stock and tree improvement stock down into those areas. So that's one we've been trying to get off the ground for about 3 years now. It's been tough. Okay, so that's enough on just some of the research that at least we're involved with. I want to get more into this discussion about climate suitability mapping and you know, how we might go about modifying some of our growth projections. And I want to pick on balsam fir because it's the one that everybody's talking about and probably the one that's most likely to be affected under climate change. If you look at the NRCan, and I pulled this off of the website last night, if you look at their projections of balsam fir, it's supposed to be completely unsuitable for New Brunswick by 2041. That's only 20 years away at best. And the midpoint of that time period, 2041 to 2070. You know, and what does that really mean? It's not the right pointer, is it? So, I mean, what does that really mean? Does that mean balsam fir is going to die in 20 years, all of it across the whole province? You know, what do we do with that information, right? So we're trying to get a handle on that. Is this really true? What is it really saying? And so I've dug in a little bit with Anthony's models, and he's based a lot of his forecasts on this climate envelope modeling approach. So if we go back a slide, and you know, if we take the balsam fir range as it exists today, and we mesh that with the climate that's there now, and then we look at where that climate is in 2040 to 2070, well, it's up here. So we just assume, okay, well, then all the balsam fir will be up there and won't be suitable anymore down here. And in a lot of process level biological stand modeling, the assumption is that where we have balsam fir in very high abundance, that's where it does the best, that's where it grows the best, that's where survival is the best. And so that's defined by this peak here. And that occurs at a growing degree days of around 1,000 to 1,500. Okay? But is that really true? Is that really where balsam fir grows the best, or is it just where it's the most abundant? And those are two different things, right? So we want to get at that. I mean, you look at the contrast with red maple, and you can see why red maple is predicted to be you know, dominant under climate change. And it's because it's got this huge growing degree day window. I'm gonna put some context to this graph throughout the presentation. I'm gonna put Fredericton on here and Green River and a few other spots to try to kind of get our brains orientated around what that really means for us. This is a growing degree day map provided by Anthony. You can go on to the NRCan site and get the same thing. And it's for the period of 1981 to 2010. And Fredericton's sitting in and around 1,800 growing degree days or so here. Up near Green River, where we'd be looking at about maybe 1,300 to 1,400 growing degree days. In just 30 years from now. I mean, these are pretty massive changes. The Edmundston kind of Campbellton area is going to look more like Fredericton in terms of climate. And Fredericton is going to look more like Portland in just 30 years. So if we step back a second to that, if we step back a second to this, and we look at the growing degree days, I mean, that would suggest that balsam fir is going to be completely annihilated in 30 years. So is that true? And I mean, how do we really use this information? Another way to look at this is for Fredericton, specifically for Fredericton, under the, and all of my climate scenarios are the 8.5 RCP 8.5 scenario. I think that's kind of the train we're on. At best, we'll be getting to 4.5, but I don't know. I mean, I think we're heading more towards 8.5. Maybe I'm a pessimist. So this is kind of where we're at right now. We're already at 2,000 growing degree days. We're already on the way on the downward trend of that balsam fir in Fredericton. By 2050, we're at 2,500. That's right at the peak. I mean, that's the end of balsam fir right there. And 3,000, that's way, way above anything. At 3,000 growing degree days, you don't see balsam fir anymore, anywhere in North America, really. It would be very, very infrequent. So if we go back to this map, or graph, and is species relative occurrence really equivalent to maximum species relative growth, survival? That's kind of the question we're asking. So if we look at where Green River is in 2020, you know, Green River, northern New Brunswick, near Edmundston, I mean, that is the balsam fir mecca, right? That's where those Baskerville Green River trials are set up. There's PSPs up there yielding 400 meters cubed per hectare of balsam fir. I mean, they're massive balsam fir trees up there. And you see that up in the Gas Bay too. So certainly balsam fir does do very well under this climate. They grow very large trees. But in Fredericton today, I mean, we're talking here. So does that mean that growth is magically 50% lower in Fredericton than it is in Green River? Like if we look at the growth rates and the PSPs in Fredericton compared to Green River, are we expecting to see twice the growth in Green River for fir as here? And also, on the flip side of that, 50% more mortality. So those are kind of the questions we have. And I'm not going to answer those questions, but we are starting to accumulate some data that is shedding some light on this. And I'll discuss that a little bit, very preliminary results. So by 2050, I mean, if I was to follow this assumption, I would almost have to kill off all the balsam fir in Fredericton by 2050 in our timber supply models. Maybe that's true, but maybe we got to think a little bit more about exactly what's going on here in terms of growth, survival, and regeneration dynamics. So this is the plot data set that we've collected with Anthony. About 400,000 plots stretching from Florida up to Newfoundland and across into Ontario and even into the prairies. And he's gone further. He's gone beyond our project. He's made partners all over North America, and he's collecting the plot data set for all of North America. So I expect to see quite a few publications out of Anthony on this in the coming years. He's pretty excited about this. The other thing that we entered into in terms of a project was looking at our existing plot data in New Brunswick and trying to get a handle on whether or not succession is markedly different in the north versus the south. Can we quantify that? Can we model if balsam fir is substantially doing much better in terms of regeneration in the north than the south? We kind of know that, but can we quantify it? Can the data show it? And we did show that, and we found that climate was the #1 driver. You know, if we disentangle a lot of other factors in terms of site, other species that are in close proximity to this area that's been recently disturbed, and management, climate was definitely the #1 driver of the proportion of balsam fir that was coming back in our cuts. And on the flip side of that, in southern regions, we were definitely getting much more birch and red maple and poplars coming back in these clear-cut areas. And this is going to be published very soon, probably within the next few weeks, in the Forest Ecology and Management. So check that out. But that tends to confirm more than deny some of the assumptions that are made in this fir model. That we are seeing almost double if not triple, the regeneration in the north of balsam fir than in the south. So in terms of regeneration, it seems like Anthony's assumptions there are in the ballpark. This is the distribution of the balsam fir plots in the data set, so plots that have balsam fir in them. And they stretch down to almost Boston, kind of New York kind of area. And over into Michigan, kind of halfway up Lake Superior is kind of where we stop. And that's in and around the 2200 to 2600 mark for growing degree days. So certainly once we get up to 2500 growing degree days, we would expect something's going on there, right? Like there's got to be some reason why, and we're not sure exactly what it is, what the mechanism is yet, but there's got to be something going on there. And is it growth, or is it survival? Is it establishment? Certainly establishment seems to be one of the primary drivers of why balsam fir does not occur down south. What about growth? So if we look at those PSPs and we pull out all the co-dominant and dominant trees, so we're trying to get rid of, factor out issues with suppression and competition. If we just look at the dominant and co-dominant trees in those plots of balsam fir, and we look at diameter increment, centimeters per year of growth across growing degree days. And we plot the 95th percentile of growth rate. So these are kind of your top performers across growing degree days.
Sorry, aren't there 365 days in a year? I don't understand why there's 2,000 growing degree days. Like, could you just clarify what that number is?
Sure. So the way the growing degree day calculation works is, first off, you'll see this base 5. Sometimes it's expressed in terms of base 10, base 0, base 5. In the US, you'll see it in Fahrenheit. And what that is, it's a threshold. Above that temperature, growing degree days are counted. And the way growing degree days are counted is they take the minimum temperature of the day, maximum temperature of the day, and you average that temperature, right, to get average temperature for the day. So minimum, maximum, divided by 2. And then you take away that base temperature. And then that is, so if it's 25 degrees during the day, then you have like on average, let's say 20, then you've got a growing degree day during that one day of 15 degrees. Okay? Does that make sense?
Sure.
So your average temperature during the day is 20 degrees, and you're counting the degrees above the base threshold temperature of 5 degrees. So that's 15 degrees. Okay, and then we add that up over all days, it's above 5 degrees on average. And that's our growing degree day measure. So it's not a measure of days of the year that plants can grow. It's a measure of kind of the sum of heat accumulation over the course of a year. And it's very useful for agricultural growing crops and also for budworm timing of insect development.
And so balsam fir just can't take a certain percentage of degree days?
We don't know. We don't know. There's something going on there at 2500 to 3000 degree days where we don't see balsam fir anymore. And we're trying to figure out, well, what is the mechanism that's causing that to happen? Is it just that, it's been thousands and thousands of years and it's just slowly been out-competed by other species? Or is there some fundamental reason why it's just keeling over and dying? Is there some sort of insect or, what is the mechanism of why it can't kind of survive beyond that threshold? And those are the key questions we want to look into here.
Is the relation of this indicator have any relationship to, a lot of plant species are triggered by the amount of sunlight hours? Seeds will only regenerate them. Yeah.
Right.
So is there any relation to that?
That could be an explanation for some species, for sure.
It doesn't have a direct relationship with the growing degree days indicator.
Right. Yeah, and it's going to vary by species. So we want to understand what is that biological mechanism. Could be maybe some sort of, freeze-thaw cycle that prevents the tree from, maybe it's drying out during the wintertime, or who knows, right? We haven't quite gotten there yet. But what we're trying to do is accumulate data to get us there. And this is that kind of first step along that road. Because we've got all those same questions, right? We want to be confident in saying that balsam fir is going to die when the temperature does increase. We don't want to just say, well, it doesn't occur down there, so it's not going to occur up here when the temperature gets to that temperature. Yeah.
So this assumption in Anthony Taylor's model is kind of a linear relationship between the climate model and the species association, its location on the map. There could be other factors at play that could speed up that progression or slow it down as well.
Sure. What factors do you have in mind?
I'm thinking more along the lines of like insect pressure. Or
Yeah, totally.
Like extreme fluctuations in climate.
Yeah. So balsam woody adelgid, right?
Sure.
We certainly see root rot more in the south than in the north with balsam fir and balsam woody adelgid. So there's a climate activity going on there that we need to better understand. In terms of this, though, I just want to kind of get back to this and point out a couple things. So I think it was kind of, I don't know if it was shocking to Anthony. It was kind of a bit of an eye opener that we weren't really seeing what was being modeled in his model. Not totally, but so here's Green River on this map, about 1,400 growing degree days. Relatively low growth rates compared to Fredericton. Generally, as temperature went up to a point, we saw increased growth potential. There's something going on over here. So this is Fredericton 2050, where certainly we're starting to see balsam fir. I don't know if the growth is petering off, but it's just not there anymore. So that tells me that it's maybe not growth that's slowing down, it's just that it's dying. It's maybe dying at an early age, would be one hypothesis. Maybe we're having earlier onset of that root rot, balsam woody adelgid, and the balsam fir is just not getting to a mature point anymore. It can grow if it's there, would be one hypothesis, but it just can't survive to maturity under these higher temperatures. So that could be one hypothesis. And that has strong implications for the way we're thinking about managing balsam fir under climate change, right? Because if we can get it there and we're happy with relatively short rotations, we might be okay for 50 years or so. Certainly something major is going to happen, but we're kind of talking about a 50-year uncertainty in terms of when these impacts are going to occur. If we plop on that climate envelope, at what temperature do we expect to see maximum occurrence of balsam fir, highest proportion on the landscape? Well, that's in and around here. And I think it's clear that we can't necessarily equate that directly to growth. They're going in opposite directions to a point. I mean, out here, we're starting to see that decline for some reason, but back here, certainly between 1,500 and 2,000, and even up into 2,500, we're getting decent growth rates out of that species. And when Anthony grows his seedlings in his growth chamber under the year 100 8.5 climate scenario with increased CO2 and increased temperature, he's seeing decent growth rates on red spruce, just as good as today. And that's kind of interesting, right? That's pointing us towards that, okay, if the species is there, it may grow pretty well. It might even grow faster under, at least in the short term, under climate change. So that leads me to make some, I guess, alternative inferences, theories, hypotheses, whatever you want to call them. And we're hoping to test this with this data. Certainly under the prediction of probability of regeneration establishment, it seems that this relationship, this kind of unimodal relationship, as Charles called it, seems to hold pretty closely to what we're seeing in terms of New Brunswick. Like, in terms of fir, we're getting our best regeneration up north in the highlands. And in Fredericton, in southern areas, it is quite a bit less. Like, we are getting 50% less, if not more, balsam fir reduction in regeneration in our clear-cut harvests, and even our partial cuts. But I think we should reconsider and possibly flip that a little bit for growth, at least for young stands. So this graph I'm showing, and I think this has an age dependence, but you know, and this is really more theory than based on data. I mean, I'm taking a little bit from our previous graph there, but I'm suggesting that if it's a young, established balsam fir, it's probably going to do decently under climate change up to a point, up to about 2,500 growing degree days. And then chances are we're going to see some pretty drastic declines, probably due to survival, root rot, balsam woody adelgid, who knows what other factors. And the survival graph might look something like this. Okay, so these are kind of our early hypotheses, and we're trying to test this with empirical information, growth chamber studies, and also our large PSP data set. And we're just getting going on that. At age 40, I guess I'm hypothesizing that we're going to see under a warmer climate, you know, an earlier death of balsam fir. We might see that in the south, balsam fir only lives for up until age 40 or age 50. Sorry, I was pointing to that. I meant to be pointing to this. And age 70, you know, much more rapid decline of balsam fir. So young stands, young PCTs, regenerating sites might be doing okay. Some of the mature balsam fir would be succumbing to mortality, root rot, balsam woody adelgid potentially earlier. And again, this is just hypothesis, but it kind of makes sense. I mean, if we look up in the north in Green River, you see these really old balsam fir that do not have root rot and are doing really, really well. And you look down in the south, and you've got balsam woody adelgid. We've got root rot. We've got root rot coming into our PCTs at like age 25, and they're almost write-offs. We don't even consider as much doing CTs in those anymore. You look down in Nova Scotia, and I mean balsam fir in Nova Scotia do not live very long. They do not get very big, but they are there, right? And they're growing at decent growth rates when they're young. It's just they kind of reach this point where they just kind of peter off at age kind of 50. So I don't know if that's helpful to think about this, but I know some of the questions this morning centered around, well, you know, what is this? How do these models really work? And this is kind of how they're working now. Everything is kind of following that very simplistic trajectory, and I'm suggesting we need to get a little bit more sophisticated for each species. And we got to bring a lot of research to bear and logical thinking about what we know about silvics of these species and our own expert observations that we've seen in the field on this to kind of help us build these relationships a bit better and gain confidence so that we can ultimately adapt and make better predictions. There's one other project I'd just like to touch on, and I've mentioned it before. It's this UMB forest adaptation, climate forest adaptation work. The title of the project is called Costs and Benefits of Adapting to Climate-Induced Changes in Drought and Wind Regimes. This part of it is largely what Charles is involved with mapping probability of drought and wind severity across New Brunswick. You saw part of that for wind severity, and he still has a lot to go on the drought. Tom Beckley and Louise Comeau are working with forest-dependent communities. They've put out a lot of surveys to try to better understand those forest-dependent communities in terms of climate change, and are developing workshops to help inform. Gaetan's also very involved with this project with the Northern Hardwood Research Institute, and part of the guidebooks that he presented today are part of that project. And I'm involved with that project as well with Van Lance and supervising some graduate students down there at UNB, trying to estimate the economic impacts of climate change. And key to that, one of the big hurdles here is trying to get a handle on those relationships of balsam fir growth and survival. And you know, it's tough. It's going to be a lot of what-if type scenarios, and we're going to have a lot more questions than answers on that one. But we'll do our best. So just in summary here, a key step towards being able to introduce these climate impacts into our strategic forest planning is really to be able to kind of disentangle the effect of climate on tree diameter growth, survival rate, and establishment. We're hoping to integrate research from both UNB and CFS and other areas to answer some of those questions. And I think if I had to make some predictions on this from what I've seen so far, it seems like we might see some increased growth rates in the short term for some of our forest. But in the long term, I think we're going to see some pretty major die-off of some of these vulnerable species. And maybe not die off in terms of young balsam fir, but in terms of earlier ages of death of balsam fir and some of these spruce species. They're just not going to be able to hang on as well due to a number of factors like insects and rot and so on. So thanks for your attention during that hour, and I'm open to any questions on either of those presentations.
Did you look at any other factors you did your models, like the average winter temperatures or the total annual precipitation, things like that?
Yeah, so Anthony has all of those at his fingertips, and for that paper that's coming out in the next couple weeks, we actually looked at probably 100 different climate variables. So he has all the climate variables at his fingertips from NRCan, and you know, you can't put all 100 in, so you try to figure out the ones that aren't directly correlated with each other. You want them to try to make some good choices on which ones you want to include. But climate moisture index, minimum winter temperature, maximum summer temperature, growing degree days, those are all ones that came in. I focused on growing degree days here just because a lot of the models that are being used to make these forest level predictions are based on growing degree days. And we're not expected to see huge changes in precipitation. It's more on the temperature side. So, yeah. But certainly as we move through this work, we're going to be looking at regressing growth and survival across all these different climate variables. Yeah.
Chris, some of the work that you reported on there today would indicate to me that maybe balsam fir is not on the cusp of falling off the edge of the earth in New Brunswick. That there are pretty good sustained growth in the balsam fir, and likely will be for some time. So does it seem? Are you? I'm not sure if you're aware that the department has recently changed the criteria for silviculture assistance in in forests, woodlots where there is a significant amount of fir, like making them ineligible for silviculture subsidy. Is that premature to have done that? It's probably a leading question, but look, I guess looking at what you've reported to me, what I've understood you to say there today, is it would indicate to me that it was maybe premature to make stands that have 50% of fir in them ineligible for thinning.
Yeah, well, I wonder if, and I wasn't involved with that particular policy, so I don't know a lot of the background behind it, but I mean, there's a lot of good reasons to get rid of fir and to not target fir silviculturally. So I don't know if climate is the only reason that policy maybe came about. I mean, we're certainly seeing issues around commercial thinning some of these balsam fir sites just because of the amount of root rot that we're seeing in some of the southern areas. I mean, maybe up north, though, it may be a bit premature if we're strictly talking about climate change. That 2,500 degree day threshold that you saw in the image there, that's not going to hit Campbellton until, well, it's projected under the 8.5 scenario until 2085. But in Fredericton, that's coming up much sooner, right? Like, we're talking 30 years away until we kind of get to that threshold. And we're not exactly sure what we're going to see at that threshold. So, you know, if I was a private woodlot owner down in southern New Brunswick, I would certainly be keen to push out fir. Whereas in the north, you know, barring spruce budworm, you know, you might have some breathing room, right? I don't know if that answers your question, Bill, but.
Well, it addresses the question. Yes, I guess just raising the question is my objective here, really.
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure that the policy was wise or not, maybe even in the south, because in terms of the lifespan of a fir tree, 30, 40 years is significant.
Yeah.
It's not, if it's already there and established,
Yeah.
and it doesn't get blown down or eaten by
Yeah.
spruce budworm,
Right.
you were showing some pretty high growth rates there.
Yeah.
Up into degree days of 2,500 to 3,000.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, that 2,500 degree day mark is kind of a big one because we don't see any fir beyond that. So that indicates to me that there's something survival related going on there. But certainly up to that point, we're getting decent growth rates on the stuff that does survive. We've yet to look at mortality. I mean, another way to look at that graph would be that all we're seeing are the winners, right? We're not seeing the ones that died. So it could be a bit of a warped perception if out around 25 we're seeing a lot of mortality and balsam fir never living beyond maybe age 30. Just a guess, but we've got to dig into it quite a bit further before we can kind of wrap our heads around some clear management around that, management strategies. Yeah.
You answered a question about the private plant silviculture and changes in consideration for, I think, for harvest-based silviculture treatments. Fir is recognized as a species that has a lot more risk and vulnerabilities associated with it in terms of, you know, like severe weather events and disease, and so I mean that is the main reasons why fir is well, we impose some restrictions on the amount of fir that we would tolerate in doing these silviculture treatments. You know, in light of all of these reasons I explained, and you know, the return on investment on those treatments. So, I mean, it is somewhat tied into what the topics that we're talking about here today. But first, certainly, as a species that is recognized as having all of these risk associated with it, and we've seen a lot of evidence of that on the ground. So, following these treatments and the success and some of the damage that these treatments suffered after treatments. Mainly due to wind damage and also breakage and all sorts of things. So really, so the silviculture program with limited funding and resources, we impose some restrictions on the sites that, well, the stands that would be candidate for these investments. So I think that addresses your question on that.
Firstly, I'd suggest a different approach, and that would be a silvicultural emphasis on an exit strategy for fir, especially in the southern areas. I mean, why, maybe not investment in silviculture activities that are going to promote its growth, but promote its, active harvesting and moving away from fir harvesting. So,
Or maybe towards some of the treatments that Gaetan mentioned. Yeah.